Science and Genesis, and if we could advance the next slide. Thank you. Science and Genesis, are they enemies or allies? And probably from the introduction, you can probably guess where I'm taking you, that they're not enemies, they're allies. And basically what I'm going to demonstrate, I gave this talk to you 15 years ago. But what I shared with you 15 years ago is the more we learn about God's book of nature, the stronger case we get for the inerrancy and inspiration of God's book of Scripture. So what you're going to see tonight is something quite different from what I gave you 15 years ago, because we've gotten so much more revelation from the book of nature, we can make a far stronger case that Genesis indeed is the inspired, inerrant Word of God. And here we're looking at the very first sentence of the Bible, and I've discovered no matter where I go in the world, people may not know John 3:16, but they all know Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, I didn't pick up a Bible till I was 17 years of age. I'll be telling that story Sunday night. But when I did pick up the Bible, I said, what is this heavens and earth? And I began to go through the Old Testament and discovered nowhere in the Old Testament do you see the word universe. But you see this phrase, the heavens and the earth, 13 times in the Old Testament, and it always refers to the totality of physical reality, all matter, energy, space, and time. So what this sentence is saying, in the beginning, God created the universe. He created the entire universe. Well, now we have space-time theorems. In fact, I was reading the Bible in my teenage years. At the same time, physicists were developing the first of the space-time theorems. Today we have over 30 of them. But these theorems are basically telling us that if the universe is expanding, and only an expanding universe allows for the existence of life. So the very fact that you're here is evidence that the universe is expanding. And the theorems say if the universe is expanding, space and time have a beginning. Space and time are created. And this is what one of the authors of the space-time theorem, Alexander Velikin, an agnostic astronomer, wrote in a book after he published one of these theorems. He says, quote, with the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. Now, what is that problem? Proof of a space-time beginning implies a causal agent beyond space and time who creates our universe of space-time, matter, and energy. Now, I remember speaking at a NASA facility, the place where they do all the Apollo efforts in Houston, and the director there said, look, we've invited you here to speak, but we don't want you to use the word God. I said, well, my whole talk is about science and God. And I said, well, how about if I talk about the causal agent beyond space and time that creates the universe and designs it all to make our existence possible? He said, yeah, you can do that. And that's basically my point here. This problem that Alexander Velikin is pointing out means that a miracle-working God must exist. And so I have a collection, about 60 books written by atheist physicists and astronomers and mathematicians, and what they all now say, this is in the last 5 years, that deism cannot be taken off the scientific table. Because of the force of the space-time theorems, everyone within the scientific community is now forced to acknowledge this causal agent must exist. Now, they're not conceding that the causal agent's a personal being, but they are saying there has to be some entity beyond space and time that created the universe. And what you're going to see in the next few minutes, it's not just a deistic God, it's a theistic God, it's a redeeming God. Okay, now my wife is an English professor by background, and she remembers when I first started giving talks to audiences like you, she would say, you know what, 23 points in your talk is too much. Boil it down to just 3 points. And that was a struggle for me with this talk, but here are my 3 points for the rest of my message. Number 1, we're going to look at the point of view for the creation days of Genesis 1. Then we're going to look at the definition of the word day that's used in Genesis 1, and then we'll spend most of our time looking at the description of the creation events and how we can scientifically test the reliability and the accuracy of Genesis 1. Okay, here's point number one. Point number one, the frame of reference for Genesis 1:1 is the universe. But Genesis 1:2 changes the frame of reference, the point of view, from the universe to the surface of earth's waters. This is what it says in Genesis 1:2. The Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Yeah, we're going to need to move ahead a couple of slides. So, go one more. Here we go. Keep going. Okay. These are the slides. Yeah, there's the 3 points. Here we are. Point one. Okay, Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. This means we're to understand the description of the 6 creation days, not from the point of view of the universe, but from the point of view of an observer on the surface of Earth's waters. That's Genesis 1:2. But Genesis does not give us the most scientifically extensive account of creation. That is from the oldest book of the Bible. Job is the oldest book of the Bible, and it gives us the most scientific content on the story of creation. And this is what it says in Job 38:9. It says, I made the clouds its garment and wrapped it in thick darkness. Because Genesis 1:2 says that water covered the whole surface of the earth, and it was dark everywhere on the surface of the earth. Job 38 explains why it's dark, that the clouds of the early earth would not permit visible light to get through. Now, if you want an analogy, think of Venus. Venus is an atmosphere 90 times thicker than planet Earth, and the only light that makes it through to the surface is at the extreme red end of the spectrum. But Earth's atmosphere began 200 times thicker than it is today. No visible light would make it to the surface at all. So, if you remember nothing else from today's talk, remember this. The point of view is the surface of the waters below the atmosphere, not above the atmosphere. The reason this is so important, I know it's inevitable, you're going to run into some geek, some scientist or engineer is going to say, I looked at Genesis 1 and it's teaching nothing but scientific nonsense. That geek is correct if you have the frame of reference above the earth, above the clouds. Then Genesis 1 is teaching nothing but scientific nonsense. But if you put the frame of reference on the surface of the earth, then it's a perfect fit, as you're going to see. And it was Galileo who first pointed this out, where he said the biggest mistake you can make in Bible interpretation is to get the wrong point of view. And Genesis 1 is probably the best example of how that can steer you wrong. So yes, remember nothing else, remember the point of view for Genesis chapter 1 is the surface of the waters. Now, the biblical Hebrew language has a very small vocabulary. There's only 3,000 words in biblical Hebrew if you don't count the names of cities and people. English is the largest vocabulary language in human history, over 4 million words. And so it's a challenge to translate biblical Hebrew, Old Testament, into English. Explains why we got 40 different English translations. Not one of them can give you a complete sense of the original. But for that reason, virtually every Hebrew noun has multiple literal definitions. The word for earth in Genesis 1 has got 5 distinct literal definitions. These are the 4 definitions for the Hebrew word for day, the word yom. It can mean part of the daylight hours, like from noon to 3 p.m. It can mean all of the daylight hours. It can mean one 24-hour period, or it can mean a long, finite period of time. So 4 distinct literal definitions. Now, when I first picked up a Bible at age 17 and began to go through it starting on page 1, I noticed that the first 6 creation days are closed off with an evening-morning phrase. And at that time, I didn't know what the original Hebrew for evening and morning meant, but I knew at a minimum it was telling me Each of these days has a start time and an end time. But when you go to day 7, there's no evening morning praise, meaning we're still in God's 7th day. And Psalm 95 and Hebrews 4 both explicitly state we're still in God's 7th day. So the 7th day, if we can have the next slide, that continues. And when I read this in my teenage years, I said, this answers the fossil record enigma. Because one of the things that happened in my childhood, I got really fascinated about physics and astronomy at age 7. I was reading 4 or 5 books a week on physics and astronomy. And when I was about 11 years of age, my parents thought I was being obsessive in my studies. I don't know why, but they did. So they tried to get me a little broader, and so they bought our family a big, thick book on evolutionary biology. I was the only one in the family that read it. But I remember going to my parents and saying, Mom, Dad, the numbers don't add up. We have all these new phyla and classes and orders before humanity, and none of that happens during humanity or after humanity. And they said, well, go talk to your science teachers. I talked to them, and they said, go talk to those science professors you know. Nobody gave me an answer until I picked up Genesis chapter 1. For 6 days, God creates. On the 7th day, he stops creating. And so Genesis 1 answers the fossil record enigma about why we see new phyla. We can have the next thing. New phyla and classes before humans, but none afterwards. Now, if you want to read more about this, I got a whole book on this, A Matter of Days, where I talk about why these days have to be long periods of time. Again, you can get a free chapter at reasons.org/Ross. And when you interpret these days as long time periods, now you can read the entire Bible literally and consistently without any contradictions. Well, I said I was going to spend most of the time on the order and description of the events. Let's begin with creation day 1. And what we see in creation day 1 is let there be light. And this is when God transforms Earth's atmosphere from being opaque to light, where light can now pass through. Now, when I was reading this at age 17 and 18, astronomers had no idea how this was playing out. Today we know that the solar system began with 5 rocky planets, and 2 of them, Theia and the proto-Earth, collided and merged. And when they merged, that caused Earth to become bigger, but the collision event caused Earth to lose virtually all of its water and all of its atmosphere. A debris cloud led to the formation of the moon. But with that atmosphere being thinned out and the water being thinned out, light could now pass through the atmosphere, photosynthesis could begin. Now we can have microbes, and now we can begin to develop oxygen in the atmosphere and pull carbon dioxide out. Now, creation day 2, in the next slide, this shows us it's the shortest of the creation day descriptions. And I remember looking at this and saying, why is this so brief? But when I looked at Job 37 and 38, I said, aha, I know. Moses could afford to be brief about creation day 2 because of how extensive Job was about the events of creation day 2. Genesis 1 is simply saying that God shaped the earth in such a way that there is water above and water below. But when you go to Job 37 and 38, it talks in detail about Earth's complex water cycle, how there's water vapor in the clouds above, liquid water in the lakes and oceans below, and how this water cycle is established so that we get 6 distinct forms of precipitation. 3 liquid forms, rain, mist, and dew, and 3 frozen forms, snow, frost, and hail. And I remember as a young man looking at this and saying, wow, this is remarkable, because we need all 6 forms to have global human civilization. I mean, the snow, the frost, and the hail, it melts slowly, so it actually enables all of our rivers to flow year-round. Frost will form at 10 degrees above the freezing point of water, so it means you can get ice even when it's fairly warm, and hail even when it's warmer. And then we get all these different forms of liquid precipitation. We need them all. But look at the fine-tuning that's necessary to have this water cycle that delivers significant amounts of all 6 forms of precipitation. Then we move into creation day 3, where it says, "Let the dry ground appear." And this is when God transforms planet Earth from a water world to where we have oceans and continents coinciding. And it's because of those oceans and continents coinciding that we can have the nutrients vital for life recycling through the oceans to the continents and back again. Now, when I was reading this for the first time at age 17, all the geology and geophysics textbooks were saying the continents have always been here. But I remember reading those books at that age and recognizing they're saying that without giving any evidence. And then I showed up at the University of British Columbia, and at that time, 2 of the 3 physicists that launched the discipline of plate tectonics were professors in the geophysics department. So as a sophomore undergraduate, I applied to get into that class. I thought, this is the first class ever taught on plate tectonics. I want in. And they let me in with a bunch of the graduate students there. And I remember going to the professors after one of their lectures and saying, okay, this is what they were saying in the 1950s, but it seems like in what you're telling us is that with plate tectonics, we got this gradual rise of continental landmass coverage over time. And I said, I notice you're showing it starting off at about 7%. Is it conceivable it could be 0%? And they said, well, anything between 0 and 10% fits the data. Yes, it could be 0. So I said, well, gee, maybe the Bible got it right after all. And then we jump forward to the year 2000, and this is a story where you basically see that Earth indeed begins as a water world. You get some volcanic islands, then plate tectonics kicks in. But as you notice in this particular graph is the period of most aggressive continental landmass buildup occurs when the Earth is a little bit less than half of its present age. Where does Genesis 1 put it? The first part of creation day 3, about a little more than halfway back in the story. But then we jump ahead to 2018, where plate tectonics and physical chemists begin to discover that the growth of the continental land masses is closely linked to great oxygenation events. And so this is now the picture for the growth of continental land masses. Come back one slide, please. There we go, thank you. And what you see is that Earth remained a complete water world for its first billion years. And then we get these little tiny cratons showing up on the face of the Earth. But at the great oxygenation event, we see the sudden jump where it jumps up from about 1.5% up to about 27%, then it slowly grows thereafter. What you're seeing here is that the more we learn about the geophysical history of the Earth, the tighter and tighter fit we get with what the Bible declared thousands of years ago. So I show you this as a dramatic example of what's happened since I was here in 2009, basically demonstrating the more we learn about the history of the Earth, the more evidence we get for the inspiration and inerrancy of what we see recorded in the Bible. And if you want to read about the details of this, you'll find it in this article. I put out an article called Today's New Reason to Believe. June 11th, 2018, I actually review for you the published papers in which this was discovered. That's part 1 of Creation Day 3. The second part of Creation Day 3, the text says, let the land produce vegetation. Genesis 1:11. Now, I've debated the executive director of the Skeptic Society, Michael Shermer, 4 times on different university campuses. We've never had a debate on Genesis, but it doesn't matter. Michael Shermer sees the early chapters of Genesis as the Achilles heel of the Christian faith. So no matter what the debate topic, he always goes for that. And I remember in the first debate I had with him, he said, your Bible can't possibly be true because it says vegetation on the continents first and animals in the oceans later, and the fossil record tells us the other way around. My response at that time was to say, well, Michael, animals have bones and shells. So their fossils are going to be preserved well for a long period of time. But that's not true of vegetation. It decays, and there's a good reason why we don't have the fossil evidence. Well, in my second debate with him, Noth and Kennedy published a paper in Nature where they said, we don't have the fossil evidence, but we got isotope evidence that vegetation was just as abundant in the continental land masses for the 200 million years that preceded the first appearance of animals in the oceans. And then 2 years later, Strother and his group basically said, we've now found the fossils. A bit of an exaggeration, all they found were fossil parts. The biggest part they found was 1 millimeter in diameter. So this kind of appreciates why we didn't have these, quote, fossils until then. They're hard to find. All you got are the decay products of the vegetation. But it's another example where the more we learn about nature, the more evidence we get that Genesis got it right thousands of years ago. Now moving into creation day 4. This is where it says, let the great lights appear, referring to the sun, moon, and stars, and explains, let them appear to creatures on the surface of the earth so that they may serve as signs to mark seasons, days, and years. Now, the vegetation doesn't need those signs, but the animals that God's going to create in day 5 do. All animals need to know the position of the sun, moon, and stars to regulate their biological clocks. So we now know that there were 2 oxygenation events. And so you see this one here that produced the continents, about 2.5 billion years ago. But about 575 million years ago, there was a very dramatic oxygenation event where the oxygen content in the atmosphere went from less than 1% and suddenly jumped up to 8%. We know what caused the sudden jump is something called the Great Unconformity. And the geological structure of Canada provides one of the most dramatic examples of the Great Unconformity. Huge landslides off the continents, which caused the oxygen to spike up in the atmosphere. Well, what happened a few years ago, a team of physicists said, let's do an experiment. So they got this giant flask, and they filled it with the atmospheric constituents of Earth's atmosphere before the oxygenation event, the second oxygenation event. Then they gradually increased the oxygen in the flask. Well, when it was below 1%, they couldn't see through the flask. It was totally hazed out. Light could pass through, but they couldn't see the opposite end of the flask. It kind of looked like this. So, just light, but you can't see what's beyond. Okay, what I've done to simulate their experiment. This is a photo I took of Engineer Peak in Colorado. And in this particular photo, I'm a little less than, I'm about a half kilometer away from the top of the mountain. Okay, so I'm pretty close. But this is what you would see of that mountain at 1% oxygen. When you push it up to 2% oxygen, you can see there's something vaguely in the background. Then we push it up to 4%, and there's a mountain there. But as we push it up to 5 and 6 and 7, and when you get to 8%, something shows up in the sky that you couldn't see in the previous images. The moon shows up. So when you only got a few percent of oxygen, you can't see the sun, moon, and stars. But at 8%, you can see the sun, moon, and stars. Verifying what it says in Genesis chapter 1. Let there be the great lights, so they may serve as signs to mark seasons, days, and years. That's Genesis 1:14. Genesis 1:16 says, so God made the sun, moon, and stars, basically making a point that God had made them as objects at some unspecified time in the past. And again, if you want to read about this, I've got an article, Today's New Reason to Believe, June 18th, 2018. Then we move into Creation Day 5. And it says, let the waters teem with living creatures. And this is the first time animals appear on the face of the earth. And what's amazing here is we go from nothing but microbes over the entire surface of the earth to the sudden appearance of animals as big as 2 meters across. Now, these are animals that are different from us. They don't have a digestive tract. They don't have a circulatory system. They're basically filter feeders. And this is called the Avalon explosion of life, where you see this transition from nothing but microbes to these large animal creatures. And then they go extinct. And then they're replaced by the Cambrian animals. And this happens when the oxygen jumps from 8% up to 10%. At 8%, that's not enough oxygen for circulatory systems and digestive tracts. But 10% is the minimum. And the moment it has 10%, you see the sudden appearance of the Cambrian animals, the Cambrian phyla. And now we got animals with brains and hearts, a digestive tract, a circulatory system, with ears and eyes. All the eye designs we see on planet Earth today were fully present at 538 million years ago. And it's the Canadian Rockies that provide us with the best demonstration of the Cambrian explosion. This has been studied in great detail, and by the way, they found a new exposure of the Cambrian explosion just a little bit off of the Canadian Rockies, so we're learning a lot more. But I'm going to give you two quotes, and these are from evolutionary biologists who have been studying the Cambrian explosion all their life. Neither one of these gentlemen is a believer, but this is what Gregory Ray says in a review paper on the Cambrian explosion. He says, the Cambrian explosion of body plans poses an outstanding problem for macroevolution. Macroevolution. He says the Cambrian explosion of body plans is perhaps the single most striking feature of the Metazoan fossil record. The rapidity with which phyla and classes appeared during the early Paleozoic, coupled with much lower rates of appearance for higher taxes since, poses an outstanding problem for macroevolution. An outstanding problem if you're trying to figure it out from a naturalistic perspective. From the perspective of the God of the Bible, supernaturally imposing this light, it's completely understandable. And this is what Kevin Peterson and his team said in a subsequent review paper, elucidating the materialistic basis, that is, a non-theistic basis for the Cambrian explosion, has become more elusive, not less, the more we know about the event itself. Or to be explicit, if you're trying to explain life history from a naturalistic perspective, it's going to be changes taking place through mutations, natural selection, gene exchange, and epigenetics. But these natural mechanisms bring out small changes. But the evolutionary claim is that the accumulation of these small changes, if you wait long enough, will produce new species. If you wait longer, the new species will give you a new genera. And then if you wait longer, the new genera will produce new families, new orders, then new classes, and last of all, phyla. But it was James Valentine in a research paper several years ago said, here's the problem. We see the exact opposite with the Avalon and Cambrian explosions. The phyla show up first, then the classes, then the orders. Last of all, we see the proliferation of species. It's the exact opposite of what you'd predict from a naturalistic perspective. Now, what he didn't write was this. The phyla show up simultaneously. So you get 50 phyla of animal structures. Phyla refers to a basic body plan. And so you get these 50 phyla all showing up at the very beginning of the Cambrian event, and they show up at the moment that oxygen allows them to exist. There's no evolutionary history. They just suddenly and simultaneously appear on the scene the moment the oxygen permits them to exist. And you'll see a lot more quotes from evolutionary biologists in this book, Improbable Planet. But what's interesting about Creation Day 5, it's the second time only you see the Hebrew verb for create, the verb bara. You see it first for the universe, describing the physical creation. You see it the second time in Creation Day 5, when God creates the birds and he creates the sea mammals. And this is a reference to what are called the soulish animals, animals that are not just physical, but they're also soulish, and that God endows them with mind, will, and emotions, so that they can emotionally bond to one another. These are the animals that will sacrifice to care for their young and emotionally bond with their young, but they're also endowed by their Creator to relate to a higher species, namely we human beings, and to serve and please human beings, basically giving us a lesson. Just as they were designed to serve and please a higher being, so we were also designed to serve and please a higher being, namely God himself. Now, when I debated Michael Shermer, he said, let me show you a second place where Genesis gets it wrong. It puts the land mammals after the sea mammals. The fossil record has it the other way around. And my response was this. Well, Genesis, creation day 5, is referring to God creating the first birds and the first sea mammals. But when you go to Genesis chapter 6, it doesn't use the word for mammals. Instead, it talks about 3 subcategories of land mammals, the subcategories that are going to be crucial for launching human civilization. Genesis 1 does not describe when God creates the first land mammals. Instead, it talks about God creating the 3 advanced categories of land mammals that are crucial for launching human civilization. And the first thing it mentions are the short-legged land mammals, namely the rodents, rabbits, mice, rats. And you say, how come they're in the mention here? Well, we human beings are very well designed to deal with a warm climate. I mean, we don't have a lot of hair in our bodies. We're tall and bipedal, so not that much sunlight falls on our bodies, and we're slim. Neanderthal, on the other hand, had a barrel-shaped body with short limbs and short legs, lots of fur. They were well designed for a cold climate. But notice how quickly we human beings drove the Neanderthals to the extinction. Why? Because we took advantage of these rodents and took their pelts and were able to sew them together to make clothing. And we now have evidence that the earliest humans were living in climate zones 15 degrees colder than what Neanderthals could withstand. They did not have clothing, we did. And the wonderful thing about these rodents, they don't mind if they're living with thousands of their buddies. They're cheap to feed and they like hanging around humans. You might have noticed that some of those rodents like hanging around your home. And then the text moves on to describe 2 different kinds of long-legged land mammals, those that are easy to tame, the herbivores, which early humans quickly tamed and domesticated for agricultural purposes. This would refer to the sheep, the goats, donkeys, horses, cows, and it's because of these animals, humans were able to greatly expand their food supply and be able to have huge fields of cultivated crops, all thanks to those animals. And when it talks about the nephesh animals, the soulish animals, to serve and to please. The herbivores serve predominantly, but it also mentions the long-legged land mammals that are difficult to tame. The herbivores are easy to tame, the carnivores are difficult to tame, but they make very pleasant human companions. And so dogs, cats, lions. When I was on the Caltech faculty, we had a student who came to class every day with his pet lion. And he would bring it into the lecture hall with about 100 students there. The first thing that lion would do was charge down to where the professor was. Terrified the professor on the first day, but the lion sat down beside the professor because he knew that's the best place to have all the students paying attention to him. And I remember that lion's favorite part of the day was lunchtime, where the lion would be taken out onto one of those big Caltech lawns, and they let out all the toddlers from preschool, and the lion loved just having all these toddlers romp with him or her at lunchtime. But also remember how that lion really resisted going home. The student had a van, and at 7:30 at night, he tried to put the lion in. The lion was doing this. No, I want to stay. I'm having fun here, relating to all these people. Today, it's illegal to have a pet lion in California, but we can have dogs, we can have cats. But one of the things number one, unlike the herbivores, they can be housebroken. And they love to entertain and relate to us human beings, to serve and to please. And of course, I got a book on this, Hidden Treasures in the Book of Job. Again, free chapter at reasons.org/Ross. And in that book, I talk about how God designed these animals to teach us crucial spiritual lessons. And it's no accident that where we see the greatest number of atheists and agnostics as those parts of the world where people have little or no contact with wild birds and wild mammals. They really are designed to teach us important spiritual lessons. I'll give you an example. As our abuse and sin of these animals causes these animals run away from us instead of towards us, likewise our sin causes us to run away from God instead of the way we're designed to come to Him and have relationship with Him. Okay, last of all, Genesis 1 talks about God creating human beings. This is the third and last time you see the word create, implying there's something brand new about human beings that never existed before. In fact, what's interesting, it uses two verbs. It says God made humans and He created humans. When it says God made humans, that means He supernaturally put together our human. And what's not new about our humans is our bodies. Other animals have physical bodies. We have a physical body. Other animals have mind, will, and emotions. We do too. But we're the only species of life that has a spirit that enables us to engage in mathematics and philosophy, theology, and discover the existence of God and relate to God. We're the only species of life on planet Earth that wonders whether or not there's a God or seeks to have a relationship with that God. We're the only species that looks up at the stars and says, hey, I wonder what all that's all about. We're the only species that engage in mathematics and philosophy and theology. And of course, we got a book on this, Who Was Adam? But here's the bottom line. And this was a major factor in my giving my life to Jesus Christ. I spent 4.5 hours going through Genesis chapter 1, checking it out with all the textbooks that I had, and recognized everything in Genesis chapter 1 is correctly described scientifically, and it's all in the correct scientific order. And I remember calculating, what's the probability that Moses, without God's help, could even get the order right, let alone the descriptions right, and realized it was less than 1 chance in 10 billion that he could guess the correct order of the events. But he got everything right, and he got the descriptions right. And so the phenomenal thing is, once we understand that Yom refers to an epoch of time, the surface of the earth is Earth's surface, and the scientific accuracy for the events of creation are 10 for 10 in the description of the events, the order of the events, and 4 for 4 in describing the initial conditions of planet Earth. Basically, what I want you to leave you with is this. The more we learn about science, the more reasons we gain to believe that the Bible is God's Word.